Thank you very much, and thanks for the organizers for having us today here. Let me start by mentioning that when it comes to geopolitical issues, it is out of the control of any development institution. And when it comes to development, we are focused on economic issues and issues related to financing the development all over the world. When it comes to the potential that we might have even within these complications, I think all the regions that we are operating in, they have a good potential when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to prosperity, when it comes even to poverty alleviation. But these are coming with risks also. One of the risks are the geopolitical issues that have been highlighted. But it is not limited to that. You know, with globalization and connectivity in trade, in IT, in AI, in also finance infrastructures, this also comes with cost. When there is something wrong happen, there might be a contagion effect that will impact many regions in the world, not only financially, but imagine, and we have been talking about AI for the past few months, and how AI might change the structure of the work of development that we are operating in. This might have also a very huge impact if anything goes wrong, and this is very important to pay attention to. This is maybe in general the way that I see how this the development can be impacted by those issues. But I'm sure my colleagues.
I mean, I like what you say. I mean, frankly, you know, you don't have any control of the geopolitical side of things, but it definitely does have contagion effect. Dr. Heike, if you could weigh in on this and how you're viewing the landscape right now and how that influences what you're doing.
No, thank you very much. And I think so everyone who knows me knows that I love car metaphors. So maybe also I'm looking at a little bit, what do we have with all these contagion effect and accumulation of risk? What's our airbag? So what is really the different instruments that we can mobilize together to really plan and utilize sort of instruments that are insurance, that are looking at first loss, that are looking at different ways of dealing with increased volatility. And I think the key is effective working together and identifying where our respective strengths and weaknesses are. So I think you asked me to talk about a project that I'm passionate about. So as the EBRD, and I'm living in Cairo, I'm very passionate about a project that has all of these elements in Egypt, with the nexus of water, food, and energy transition, which was launched at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, with the ambition to transition the whole energy sector in Egypt from inefficient fossil fuels, investing in transmission, and being future ready with more renewables. And so I think it made sure that every element needs to work. So there was new private investors that want to take Egyptian risk and set up solar and wind farms in Egypt. But then also the government utilizes the risk mitigants to build infrastructure, transmission lines that will also eventually potentially connect to Europe. And they come together with building just transition for the decommissioning of the inefficient plants, so that really workers can find new opportunities. So I think I like it when everything comes together in accelerating transition.
And that's really, I mean, it's really fascinating, because you're talking about a long-term project, right? That's going to solve long-term issues.
Absolutely.
But the short term constraints can come at you and can come at you fast. If you look at what the Egyptian pound has been doing, you've got currency devaluation, you're worried about economic stability and things like that. To what extent can those shorter term issues really derail these long-term projects which come with the hefty price tag at the end of the day?
I think absolutely you need to future-proof them in the sense that now, for example, everything is more expensive for building a solar farm in Egypt. It's more expensive than it was a year ago. It's more expensive in dollars. So we all need to come together and see, so how can we mitigate some of these expenses? How can we structure something more long-term so that it's still affordable today to build solar power? But for example, I mean, solar power is the cheapest source of electricity in Egypt. So it has an overarching superiority of all other energy. But still we need to spend money to build it. And so we need to get money there at the moment at a cost which is more expensive because of all the global macro and geopolitical strains. And then I think more importantly, we need to build these long-term infrastructure, which is just expensive for governments.
It's expensive.
And so there, I think we as development banks, we are asked to really dig deep and development partners. So for this NUAFI program, we mobilized also 500 million of super concessional funding to enable this expansion.
I'll get into the funding types. I think that's really important. Dr. Tar, great to have you with us. I mean, you're focusing on Africa predominantly. How would you describe the landscape on the continent right now? And I think that's the pricing of risk, right? And what you're seeing. You know, I had a chat with President Kagame this morning. We were talking about coups in the west of Africa, how that influences, frankly, the pricing of everything, right? Because then perceptions of risk in Africa continue to plague the continent. However beautiful a project might seem or investable it might seem, it's that perception of risk that needs to change.
No, as you rightly said, risk perception is very subjective. And Africa is perceived as a very high-risk continent, and this is priced in any financing provided to Africa by capital markets. And we have seen over the past few years, most of the African countries were not able to go back to the market because precisely of the high interest rate and the risk margin, the risk premium, which is imposed on African countries. And there is a big debate currently in Africa around the rating agencies and how they are rating or downgrading African country based on perceived risk. Of course, Africa is a continent of opportunities. There are some risks. And by the way, Africa contributes around 3 to 4% of global emission, but Africa is the continent which is the most suffering from the climate change impact in terms of floods, but also in terms of drought, in terms of other calamities. In terms of interest rate in Africa, currently we have seen a slight improvement in the perception by the market of the African risk because during 2020, the first quarter of 2024, precisely in January and February, we have seen 2 African countries going back to the capital market. That was Cote d'Ivoire and Benin, with single-digit interest rate. And that's a big improvement for B-rated countries. So it's a new development in the capital market, which augure of a good prospect for the continent, but yet the feeling of African leaders and the feeling of the diaspora of Africa is that the African risk is unduly, highly assessed, and the risk premium which is paid on the African debt is quite high compared to the real risk. And you just mentioned the
Should
coup.
it be?
You just mentioned the coups would happen in some African countries. But regardless of this coup, the country are still paying their debt, and none of them has defaulted so far. And we at the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, we have been working with African countries for almost 50 years. We will be celebrating next week our 50th anniversary, and we have zero loss in Africa over 50 years. So
that, ladies and gentlemen, deserves a round of applause for the African continent. I grew up in South Africa, so for me, that makes me very proud. So you haven't had any losses from the continent? No. Very commendable.
And moreover, our NPL level is less than 1%.
Yeah. All right. I want to get in Dr. Saran as well. Welcome, sir. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
What do you, I mean, you know, you have the benefits of hearing all our other delegates and panelists talking about their experience.
Yeah.
How do you want to weigh into this macro story?
You know, first I really was tickled when I got an invitation to speak on a panel which put Afro-Eurasian landscape at the center of it.
I'm perplexed as well, actually, because
But it's important because for thousands of years, it's this landscape that has produced globalization, that has produced growth, that has produced economic vitality.
Yeah.
Barring the last 70 years, when McDonald's took over the world, it is largely this landscape that has been the undergirding of humankind. So I'm really happy that we are putting this troika back together and starting to think about it in one frame. I think that's important. So thank you for framing it in this way. It's an important geography, a cluster to talk about. Number two, I think Africa is not the risk. Not investing in Africa is the risk. And I think we have to rethink the way we are engaging with certain geographies today. Let me put it in clear terms. If you don't put money in parts of Asia and the African continent today, you will not be able to battle climate change. 1/3 of all future emissions are going to come from South Asia. 1/3 of emissions are going to come from Africa. Unless 2/3 of global capital, green finance, is deployed in these geographies, you're not going to be able to achieve your climate mitigation goals. 2/3 of your emissions are going to be mitigated here. The good news, nearly 2/3 of much of these geographies are yet to be built. Which means if we get it right, and to your point, if we get it right, these could be green, these could be sustainable, these could be low emitting, and these could be agile and resilient, so that we could have infrastructure that relates both to deserts and downpours at the same time.
I'm quite excited about what you said, because you said, you know, a lot more emissions are going to come from Africa, which means...
And India.
And India. But the reason I'm excited about that is it means that you're banking on industrialization truly happening in Africa for that to be a consequence, frankly.
The trends are visible. Half of Africa is in their teens and below. That continent is not even started consuming yet. And we have to just do the maths, that we are seeing trends that tell us this is likely to be the case. And this is not based on reports coming out of Africa. These are Western scholarships predicting emission trend lines. And you are bound to see a change in lifestyles and aspirations drive up emissions if we don't get it right. And therefore, we have a unique opportunity to solve development goals, to respond to climate change, to create green jobs, and to create cohesive, resilient societies if we are able to invest in it. And I completely agree with the previous speaker. Right now, global credit systems and the financial risk assessment is voodoo science. There is absolute subjectivity in how we price money, how we price capital, right? The cost of capital for a solar plant in India is 30% higher than the cost of capital for a solar plant in Europe. Why? Now, I'll tell you why. The reason is because while much of the world has moved beyond from the colonial times, the financial system was still designed in those times. It was the Bretton Woods conversations happened before 60% of the UN members had their own flags. So the financial system is still living in a colonial era where people of color are meant to be risky and people without color are meant to be safe. And that, let's be honest here.
And it's still, I mean, to be honest.
I'm just being a little blunt here, pardon my being a little rude. But let me just give you an interesting story. As Greece and other economies were failing in Europe, and the BRICS were putting together a $50 billion package for them, The sovereign rating of Greece was higher than that of India or China or any of the BRICS members. We were bailing them out and the credit system gave them a higher credit rating. Now, if this is not colonial architecture, what is?
Brilliant. By the way, I'm also Greek, so thank you for the... I'm from everywhere, global citizen. Dr. Alkhalifa, I really want to talk about the pricing here because, and what Dr. Saran was talking about. I'm passionate about the pricing structures on the continent because I see projects and economies. I speak to so many people in Africa and I just see them buckling under the servicing of the debt. There's one particular project that I'm fascinated by. You're doing work in Niger. And Niger has been through a coup. We know that there are sanctions against Niger by African countries. Nigeria stopped selling electricity to Niger. The solar project is going to be one way to help. So how do you price what you're doing in a country that has experienced a coup, that has been pushed aside by its own neighbors?
Okay, this is a good question.
Thank you.
Before I go to that, maybe the pricing that my colleagues has mentioned when it comes to pricing capital cost. It is important to distinguish between government and private sector. And we all know that the future is private sector. Government financing is very important, but it will not be sustainable. The sustainable way of financing development is through private sector. And when it comes to private sector, this is the unfortunate fact, is the cost of capital for private sector in low-income countries is much higher than when it compared to more advanced economies. This is also very important fact, and unless we do something about it, private sector will not be encouraged to do more business, which is the way for, in my view, for development. As you know, OPEC fund was established 50 years ago almost, and United Arab Emirates and other countries are the member countries in our fund. And since then, we have grown in our commitments, in our delivery, in our portfolio, and our mandate is global mandate, but 50% of our projects done in Africa. Many of the projects that we are doing there is focusing on quality, and everybody knows, and maybe also I'm taking what my colleagues has mentioned about the risk, but these institutions were created to take risk. We are not created to maybe work and compete with commercial banks or other financiers. We are created to take risk in very difficult areas around the world. We have done, as I said, almost 50% of our portfolio is in Africa. It's in different windows, public sector and private sector also. We are financing, we have window to finance private sector. Many projects that are focusing on quality. One of the projects, I'll come back to Niger, but one of the projects is on energy transition. And to be exact, it's in clean cooking in Madagascar. As you know, 90% of Madagascar population use wood to fire and make their cooking. And this has multiple effects, be it health, environment, and even on women. And what we are doing is to have a program where we can transfer mass transfer of households to a clean cooking devices. But not stopping at that, also reforestation of the degraded forests. And the third component is empowerment of women, because the women that used to have 10 hours of her time every day bringing the wood and fire it and making the cook it will take 10 minutes. And we are taking that time just to upgrade the level of knowledge of those households and make that transition.
And it's important, I mean, really important examples you're giving me, because these are exactly the things I'm passionate about, especially when it comes to empowering women and the waste of time chopping down wood and cooking. But I want to know about the pricing. You know, what is your return on investment? Because that is really important, you know, and I'm going to refer back to what the president of Seychelles once told me. And he said, you know, they want to give us money, but then it costs so much that it's going to get us in debt. So it's just not worth it. We don't want to work with institutions that are going to be pricing things that are, you know, just not workable and doable. So what is your pricing model?
In our case, in OPEC fund, we have two windows.
Yeah.
One for LICs, low-income countries, which is mostly IDA countries. The pricing there is very concessional. It's on average 1%. That is the average. Some of them lower and some of them higher, but the average is 1%. We have other window for middle income countries, which is can take more the pricing. This kind of pricing structure is just to ensure the sustainability of our institution.
Yes.
As you know, these institutions are not maximizing their profits. They are maximizing their development impact. But with that,
You need
we have
sustainable.
to, exactly,
Uh,
we have
no,
to have a
absolutely.
sustainable model to ensure
Okay,
that.
I want to move on because we've got about 8 minutes left. Heike, I want you to jump in here because I think the pricing that we spoke about, but also I want to take a step back here and look at the overall topic. It's where will economic development thrive most? So where do you see it happening? Is it Africa that you're excited the most? Is it, as Dr. Saran was saying, it's good that we, you know, putting in Eurasia and Africa, or Africa and Asia, Africa and Europe again together and piling that together and looking at opportunities. How do you see that playing out?
I mean, if you look at potential growth rates, of course, they are the largest in Africa and in parts of Asia. I think, you know, Europe will never reach these growth rates again. So actually, absolutely, from a growth perspective, the future is in Asia and in Africa. And I think also we're all looking now at green investment potential. I think I definitely want to agree with, if we get it right now, we'll actually mitigate and adapt already in these big growing opportunities in a green, sustainable fashion. But I also want to say these are also the areas that would help the green transformation of these aging economies in Europe. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the key is, for example, I mean, why, I'm just coming back to the solar example, why is solar perceived to be cheaper in Europe where the sun doesn't shine? I mean, I'm German, so it never shines. And
So
then,
please explain to us, because you hold the key to the money. So tell us.
but actually, if you look at only the project cost, you should produce the kilowatt hour in North Africa at less than $2. And so that is the most efficient way of producing solar energy. And then you should actually transport and link this green energy to economies where it's more expensive and less efficient to produce. So I think the opportunities in Africa and Asia are not just future-proofing and greening their own economies, but it is actually providing the green electricity to, you know, decarbonize all of this legacy, hard-to-decarbonize sectors that we have seen in Europe and the States. So I think definitely the focus of investment should be at these future markets. And I want to say one thing on pricing, because of course the provocative nature, but I do think we are too constrained on sovereign risks.
Correct.
I think we need to look at the project risk. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also what we've seen in, why can the OPEC fund work in Niger in this, because it's also looking at the project risk. And so we need to look more at private to private solutions. So why does all the electricity have to be sold to the government to sell it to the private sector? I think what we see in EBRD helping countries like Jordan, but also Egypt, to sell solar and wind from a private developer to a private company works much better.
Just so my understanding is that sovereign risk, right, is priced at a certain level by the ratings agencies, and then the private sector is below the sovereign risk. The private sector can't be above the sovereign
I think the
rating.
private sector can be a better risk than the sovereign. But I think we all now in our very sort of conservative model say, okay, if that's the sovereign risk, and then we add all the other risks on top of it, versus we should look at, okay, what's the project risk? And maybe the sovereign has an impact, of course, but I think we need to be a bit more flexible, a bit more tailor-made in our risk assessments.
Dr. Saran, I want you to jump in here as well.
So, Madam Chair, I just want, on your point and the conversation on pricing, I think there are 3 clear roadmaps that we can chase. First, I think we need to cluster many of these projects into a clutch of offerings that can then be given risk guarantees through MEGAs, through the MEGA framework or MEGA on steroid framework, where the rich countries who have not yet delivered on their $100 billion a year can actually at least offer the insurance on any non-performance.
We're so behind on their $100 million a year, it's scary.
Correct. So we don't need the money. Please protect your banks for the risks they take, and so that we can price it right. So I think we have to think about, we have to be creative in how we give guarantees to many of these large projects. That's the first. The second, of course, is what I always, something that Heike mentioned as well, is I think we need to now rethink the credit risk system completely. We have to now move the sovereign out of play, and we now have to earmark global projects of global importance, and they could be based on climate change, they could be based on sustainable development goals, and these must be global initiatives that are given a new credit risk assessment based on global importance of these particular projects. If climate risk is the largest challenge to humankind, you cannot certainly allow other risks to dilute action on that front.
I agree with you. I'm just thinking, what you're saying to price things differently and create...
We have to price it differently.
But I'm just thinking more bureaucracy and more policy, by then we'll be underwater or...
In fact, I'm very happy if it helps for the UK or the Germans to have their sticker on the solar plant in Niger, if that lowers the cost of capital. We are happy to give them the sovereign flag there, if you can lower the risk. And the third and final one, I think, and let's be honest here, the African nations and many in Asia, including India, we also have to really transform our own financial systems at home. Just a hypothetical question to all of us. If tomorrow an institution comes and tells us, here are $100 billion for green projects, do any of the countries have the capacity to absorb them, then deploy them, then distribute them? I think we have to do a lot of work at home to be able to absorb the large pool of capital. The largest ever known to humankind is coming our way. We have to be ready to use it and deploy it and produce gainfully from it for the benefit of all.
A vital point. There aren't enough bankable projects, or the projects are too small.
Correct.
Some companies, some developmental agencies, or whoever the investor is, well, we don't look at anything below $1 billion. I mean, there aren't enough $1 billion projects on the continent, frankly. Doctor.
But as in Africa currently, there are projects who can be really ready to absorb. I think the narrative about Africa is changing and changing very fast. Africans are now really in a position to absorb huge amount. Let us take Inga, for instance. Inga is a dam which can provide enough electricity for all the continent. And that need a huge amount of financing. If that financing is ready, there are currently African institutions who are ready to fund the feasibility study, to fund the daily design. And we at the Arab Bank for Economic Development for Africa, for instance, we are partnering with many African institutions, and currently we funded a study for the first electrical vehicle to be produced from African resources, because as you know, most of the resources to produce electrical vehicle are in Africa. So now, last week, we had, with some other institution in Zambia, a forum on creating a special economic zone between Zambia and DRC to be the future zone for producing electrical batteries, not only for Africa, but for the whole world. And the feasibility study has been funded by Badea, and
But to
sister
do that, you
institutions.
need infrastructure, right? You need electricity, uninterrupted electricity.
Electricity, for
You need-
instance, but food also, food.
Yes.
Africa has more than 65% of Arab land not cultivated in the world. So you have a river everywhere. So Africa can feed the world, definitely, and can absorb. But we have to change the risk perception of the African continent by the financial markets.
The reality is Africa has so many amazing commodities. Emerging markets have incredible commodities. They export raw. The point is to industrialize and increase value chains. But we rely on people like you to give the money to help us fund these projects. So all eyes on you to change the world. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you.
No pressure whatsoever. Next year we'll find out how you've changed things. Thank you so much to all of you. Fantastic to have you on, ladies and gentlemen.